Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So guys, I just read a report that completely blew my mind. This is something that was just published about a week ago by Dr. Peter Pry, who is Executive Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. So we're going to talk about why this report is so important right now. Nobody knows this. And everybody is sleepwalking when it comes to the potential for a nuclear crisis of apocalyptic proportions. Now, before we jump into that, let's just touch a bit on the headlines. Okay, we got Deltacron right now, which is in the news, and some other strain of Omicron out in China, which is shutting things down. I've just gotten word from many Chinese manufacturers that they're going to be going into lockdown pretty soon, and they're not going to be able to export stuff. So we are going to see the supply chain crisis continue, if not intensify, incredibly, because of the fact that now it's at the level of manufacturing. So it's not so much just a bottleneck with our own ports. Now it's going to be an issue of China isn't able to make enough stuff, as if we don't have enough global trade issues going on as is. We got Saudi threatening once again with the petrol yuan, which is going to increase the likelihood that people are going to be ditching the US dollar. And all of this comes on the heels, of course, of the Russian invasion. Now, in terms of the Russian invasion, we have three heads of state that have went to Kiev, of all places. And this is incredibly concerning and not getting enough news. If you ask me, you have the heads of state of Poland, Lithuania, and Czechoslovakia, who all, and I'm talking about the prime ministers, I'm not talking about diplomats, I'm talking about the actual prime ministers, went to Kiev to meet with Zelensky. Now, I'm not sure when this meeting took place. Apparently it was kept on the low. But a part of me is thinking, well, wouldn't they want to notify the Russians that, hey, we're going in here, and if you shoot us, then, that's potentially going to be World War III. So I'm sure that there was some communication, whether it was in the Turkey diplomatic process or whatnot, that made sure that these three heads of state were not targeted. Because if that were to happen, then that would inevitably lead to World War III. Now, this is concerning because it shows that they're so concerned about their security within that region that they're willing to go to Kiev to meet with Zelensky. So that means that this thing is escalating. Don't be fooled by a lot of the media reports. The Russian military is insanely powerful, okay? And you cannot underestimate the sheer amount of the scope and size of the military in terms of manpower, as well as their armored vehicles, tanks, planes. They have pretty much an infinite amount of this stuff at their disposal. All this stuff about how they're running out of ammunition. Guys, Russia is the second biggest exporter of munitions worldwide, just next to the United States. All that surplus ammo, as corrosive and crappy as it is for your firearms as it may be, it is coming out of Russia, okay? So there's no shortage of ammo and bombs and missiles in Russia. I think they've only fired 1,000 missiles. You think they are running out of missiles when they've only fired 1,000 missiles? These guys have 5,000 nuclear missiles, okay? That's just nuclear. Never mind 1,000 regular, short or intermediate range missiles. They probably got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of those. So we are really underestimating Russia's capability. And the fact that three of those heads of state were willing to go to Kiev to war game with Zelensky tells us that this thing is about to pop in a big way. Now, I just read a report by Dr. Peter Vincent Pry that completely blew my mind because I didn't know almost any of this stuff. I was completely oblivious. I thought that the United States had nuclear superiority on another level, and perhaps I was ignorant, and I definitely was. But I do know that a lot of people think that just because you have a $1 trillion military budget, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're better prepared to fight a major war. Because think about where a lot of that money goes. A lot of it goes to pork barrel spending, wasteful government spending on stuff. Then you have the fact that you're trying to maintain all of these military bases around the world. So the amount of stuff that goes into research and development isn't as much as people think. Now, sure, there's a black budget with the CIA, and we don't know what really high technology they have that they're not showing us. Obviously, they wouldn't want to disclose that for national security reasons. But this is why you can have a smaller country that has a very dedicated budget, which they're devoting to one thing, be it missile defense, which is why Russian missile defense systems are the best in the world, because this is what they focused on. Their military is basically wired for a war in Europe and World War III. So just because, China only spends 1/4 the amount that the US spends on military expenditures, that doesn't necessarily translate into military power and might when it comes to a World War III situation. And remember that the US is spread out. It's become blatantly obvious to me why they pulled out of Afghanistan, because they're going to have stuff going on in Taiwan soon with China, most likely. They're going to have stuff going on, of course, in Europe. And were they tied up in Afghanistan, then this would be a very serious problem of the U.S. military being spread far too thin. So I think that they anticipated this move by Putin, and they pulled out of there knowing that they basically had to get out of there, okay, or else they were going to be spread way too thin. Now, let's just jump right into this. Okay, so Peter Pry, weapons specialist, worked for the CIA, very well known in the preparedness community because he's one of the authors of the EMP Commission report. He's always been pressing for an increase in our focus on hardening the grid to EMP attack and modernizing the nuclear weapon supply. Now, think about that what you may. Your mind might change after we talk about some of the reasons why he's an advocate of that, okay? Peter Pry thinks that the Biden administration is either lying or incompetent about the nuclear risk, because we've seen in the media how the U.S. is not really taking the Russian threats of a nuclear Armageddon that seriously. Are they just downplaying it and doing something else behind the scenes? I suspect so. I don't think they're as naive to the Russian threat as Peter Pry might believe, but it may well be the case. You just never know with Sleepy Joe. So we know that Putin apparently had, I shouldn't say we know, but allegedly Putin retreated to a nuclear bunker on high state of readiness for a nuclear war at several points throughout this crisis. We know that Russia's nuclear bunkers can accommodate up to 30,000 elites, and these bunkers are impervious to nuclear weapons. This is just what we know about. We know that Moscow has an underground system of tunnels and bunkers which can accommodate, allegedly, all of the population. Now, whether this is just propaganda to put Moscowians' mind at ease. Moscowian, is that a word? I don't know. But we know that Russia is dug in, okay? They are ready to ride out a nuclear apocalypse. And I know a lot of people are going to say right in the comment section right now, there's no way to survive a nuclear apocalypse. But by the time I'm done explaining this to you, you may well feel otherwise, because Russia's philosophy of nuclear weapons is completely different from the USA. Now, Peter Pry wrote this report, The Nuclear 9/11 in Our Future, and it details all of this. It's only about 6 pages long, so go check it out. And I'm going to try to get him on the channel because he's a very knowledgeable guy. He believes that if a nuclear war were to happen, it would happen by surprise attack. Now, in the West, we've been indoctrinated to believe that this thing called mutually assured destruction would be a nuclear deterrent, would prevent us from ever going down that road of World War III, because were one nation to launch nuke, the adversary nation, be it NATO or Russia, would respond, and that would mean the end of the world, because you'd have nuclear winter and yada, yada, yada. However, Russia doesn't have this philosophy, okay? Putin and Russia actually think that they can win a nuclear war if they have a sufficient first strike advantage. Now, there's a lot more to it that you need to understand, because the U.S. nuclear capability is not what it seems, okay? So in the USA, they have about 1,500 operational nuclear weapons. The rest of those nukes, the other 3,000 or 4,000 or so, are in stockpiles. They're in storage, okay? They're going to take months, if not years, to get ready. So basically, they're just not that useful right now. Now, the only ICBMs that are going to be extremely effective in an immediate sense are going to be the ICBMs that are in the ground, the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. And there's about 400 of those, allegedly. The Russians know exactly where they all are. So in the case of a first strike, they would be the primary targets, along with the rest of the nuclear triad, which is bombers, submarines, and then your missile silos. Okay, so you have your land-based missile silos, your bombers, and then of course you have your submarines. Now, I'm not sure if the US has portable nukes like the Russians have. The Russians have explored things like putting them on trains, on mobile platforms that they can move around. Okay, so in such case that a nuke was inbound, you could potentially move this thing away from a blast zone, and of course you could have them constantly moving around the country. Of course, if that was the case, then the US would likely know where they were and be tracking them at all times, you would expect. But according to this report, perhaps we're a little incompetent in that regard. Now, everybody always talks about the US nuclear submarines. According to Dr. Peter Pry, he says that most submarines are at port, the nuclear submarines of the US's inventory are at port most of the time, and they're only equipped with intermediate range missiles. So in order for them to effectively launch, they would actually have to, of course, go out to sea, which would take time, and then strike their target. So the only option that's available in an immediate sense are the Minuteman III missiles that are in the ground, the 400 Minuteman missiles. And the bomber force takes 3 days to really generate and get moving, unless you're on like a DEFCON 1, in which they probably would be up in the air. But, it's according to the Russians, this is obsolete technology, which is why they don't even bother with their bomber force. They do have one, but it's not emphasized at all because they just view it as, when you look at the capabilities of submarines and their mobile ICBM platforms, there's just no point, okay? Because they're just obsolete. So the US puts too much stock in strategic bombers. A lot of the US inventory is old and untested. Some of it's 30, 40 years old. So there's a debate about whether or not the stuff would even work, okay? And the US is not in a state of readiness that is expecting a surprise attack from Russia. Now, we're still in that mindset of mutually assured destruction and how, it's just there as a bargaining tool on the diplomatic front of things, not so much as a strategic weapon in order to actually fight a nuclear war. Whereas he argues that the Russians are actually training to win a nuclear war. Russia has a different strategic culture. He says they have a paranoia, which is rooted, of course, in being invaded numerous times in the past. And, this is justifiable considering how many people have died in recent incursions into their territory, whether that was from Asia or from Europe. And they essentially never want to be surprised again. So the majority of their forces are in ICBMs. The first things that they would target on the US end of things would be the ports that the submarines are docked at. They would target, of course, the 400 Minuteman missiles, which would be not too far south of where I am. So I'm pretty sure it would be an irradiated wasteland where I live. And that makes me consider possibly getting the hell out of this region. Because if it went down, I think this would be a bad place to be. And by that, I mean the North Dakota, north central United States region. They would also, of course, target the bombers, which would be probably destroyed instantly. So the idea that the nuclear submarines are the end all and be all, he's saying that they would wipe out the submarines, or at least the submarines wouldn't be able to get their missiles off fast enough to prevent a lot of the major damage to the missile silos and possibly even some critical infrastructure in the United States. A lot of people are worried about these missiles targeting cities. But the fact of the matter is if you are going to be engaged in a first strike in a nuclear war, all of those missiles, the majority, are going to be targeting the enemies, whoever that might be, from Russia's perspective or America's perspective, their ability to respond. So you're targeting their nuclear triad. You're targeting their missile defense systems possibly also. Now, Russian submarines, on the other hand, have intercontinental ballistic missiles, and these things can fire, I can't remember how many, but they can fire really, really fast, okay? And they can actually fire their ICBMs from port. So unlike the US submarines that have to go out, get closer to Russia to fire off their load, these ones can fire from anywhere in the world, essentially. And that makes them deadly dangerous. And their force is wired in such a way that their command and control can't be compromised by any preemptive moves on the basis of the U.S. So whether that might be the U.S. detonating an EMP strike, which he thinks Russia would first utilize EMPs in order to try to take out command and control that way and potentially even damage the electrical grid that's going to enable a lot of these missiles from being shot from the ground, okay? Now, a lot of these places are going to be hardened to an EMP attack just by virtue of being buried in the ground. That's going to attenuate a lot of that electromagnetic pulse effect, which may make it not that effective. But nonetheless, you know, if you were to drop 4 or 5 EMP nukes, take out the entire U.S. power grid, take out a significant portion of our ability to launch missiles or wage some kind of counteroffensive, and then you follow up with a volley of missiles, then we're talking about some bad times ahead. Pretty much on every front. He goes into great detail about Russia has a tactical nuclear advantage, how Russian forces are more modern, how Russia has super EMP weapons. I know that sounds like crazy sci-fi stuff, but apparently it's true. Russia has more warheads ready to go and much bigger warheads, okay? So his theory is that Russia could win a nuclear war against the United States if it was to happen right now and if they just had a marginal surprise attack. Now, there's also the issue of hypersonic weapons. Now, contrary to popular belief, hypersonic weapons aren't faster than intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the benefits is that they can, in some cases, evade radar, so they can fly a lot lower. They can fly incredibly fast compared to standard intermediate range missiles. And they can also maneuver, so they can evade. It's almost impossible to shoot these things down with missile defense. It's virtually impossible. And so you have those 3 things, okay? So they're very fast. Not as fast as ICBMs, which, if launched anywhere in the world, can get on the other side of the world in like 20 minutes. But hypersonic weapons do allow Russia to have a first strike advantage. And because the U.S. military has been so focused on projecting power in a conventional sense, their budget has been tied up in that. Their budget has been tied up in maintaining military bases and this bloated military spending. So don't confuse, we're spending $1 trillion on our military with our military is better than yours because you only spend $50 billion. Remember that NASA wanted to have a pen that rode in space, so and I don't even know if this is true, it could just be, urban legend or whatever. NASA had a pen that they wanted to use in space, and because the pens aren't pressurized, okay, pens don't work in space. So they spent $1 million to create a pen that would work in space, whereas the Russians just used a pencil, okay? And this is part of the issue with when you get government and corporations in the mix. It's all about, who can get the contracts, who can make the most money. So there's a profit motive there. According to Russia's Ministry of Emergency Situations, in the event of a nuclear attack on Moscow, there is space in underground facilities for all of the population. Can you say the same for New York City? I don't think so. Moscow is famous for the massive amount of bunkers it has for civil defense. Now, one thing to consider, though, is that Moscow would likely be the target of dozens of nuclear missiles. Like, let's be honest. And just for that reason alone, I can't see people surviving, at least not too long afterwards, even if they all were able to retreat to a bunker. Now, although economic sanctions have all but neutered much of the nation's military modernization efforts, Russia has managed to keep itself relevant in the 21st century by fielding headline-grabbing exotic weapons, including massive nukes, far greater in scale than anything Uncle Sam has to offer. With nuclear weapons like the RS-28 Sarmat ICBM, aka the Satan missile, and the Status 6 Oceanic Multipurpose System submersible drone, Russia can cause greater devastation to its targets today than at any point during the Cold War. And I should add that they can cause more devastation than the United States is capable of, okay? this Satan II heavy intercontinental ballistic missile. Listen to this. RS-28, sometimes known as Satan II, has been in development since 2014 and has been famously described as capable of wiping out parts of the earth the size of Texas or France. Okay? We're talking about a missile having a range of 6,500 miles, carries a warhead jam-packed with multiple independent re-entry vehicles. So when an ICBM goes up, it breaks off into a bunch of different multiple independent re-entry vehicles. Some of them are decoys to try to, fool missile defense systems. So even if you were able to defend against some, you could be just hitting the decoys. And there's going to be multiple warheads, which then go on trajectories to their designated places and just wreak total havoc. They can have a combined destructive yield of 50 megatons. In other words, the RS-28 Sarmat creates a destructive yield greater than 35 times that of a Minuteman III missile. Okay? But if a missile dubbed Satan II, marketed as a way to remove Texas from the map, isn't massive enough, Russia also boasts another doomsday nuke, one said to match or even double the nuclear yield of the Sarmat, while bolstering its destructive capacity by creating an unnatural natural disaster of 100 megatons. 100 megatons. I believe Nagasaki was 15 kilotons. So multiply that by, what are we at here? We'll just say, give or take 10, 100, 75 times 100, about 7,500 times more powerful than the bomb that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is just terrifying. Now, they also have this submarine-based drone system in which I'm not going to go into great detail about this one, but you can go and research it if you want. It's the Status 6 Oceanic Multipurpose System. And basically, it's a submarine that can launch these nuclear drones, which can sit dormant, virtually undetectable, and they can create massive tsunamis, like 100 megaton nuclear explosions, which would just create a radioactive tsunami, the likes of which we've never seen before. And you could put that along one of the coastal waters if they wanted to, and that would wipe out many of the cities on the West Coast. Okay, so this threat of nuclear annihilation is not something that should be taken lightly, according to this report. I'm going to post a link to the report in the description below. This was just written on March 10th, The Nuclear 9/11 in Our Future by Dr. Peter Pry. I would encourage you to go and check it out. And we will try to get him on the channel because he's incredibly knowledgeable about this stuff. And I think he's got a lot of vital information that this day and age is more meaningful now than ever before. Because remember, guys, there are high-ranking military generals around the world who are saying that we've never been this close to nuclear war throughout the entire history of the Cold War, that this is a more severe crisis than what we faced with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis, primarily because this is the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. Okay, and a lot of people don't know the backstory about the reasons why the Russians went in. Well, there's a lot of things. There's missile defense systems. There's the potential for nukes at their doorstep. There's NATO pushing eastward. There's a lot of factors that went into this. It wasn't just Vladimir woke up one day and said, you know what, I'm going to be the enemy of the planet. It's not that simple. People need to take this threat seriously. I'm strongly considering, on the basis of this information, moving, to be brutally honest, because a lot of people are under the impression, and this is why there's potentially not a lot of safe havens, because on the East Coast, you have all the nuclear reactors with which, if they could not be maintained, okay, if the spent fuel rods could not be maintained after a nuclear war, then it would, we would be virtually in an irradiated wasteland. Now, that's not to say that everybody's going to die, because not everybody's going to die, and that's the scary part. The Southern Hemisphere will be largely spared from a lot of the nuclear exchange, but they would, of course, get the fallout eventually. The climactic patterns as a result of detonating all these nukes at once would have a drastic effect as well. But based on Peter Pry's assessment, he thinks that what could possibly happen is the U.S. wouldn't be able to blow a huge portion of their wad. Yes, Russia would take a big hit, but not as big as a lot of people think. and that the hit that we would take would be much more substantial. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. Stay prepped. I just want to remind you guys that Jace Medical is now available in Canada. Go through the link in the description. You can get your antibiotics, you can get your chronic meds. Basically, you can get extra supplies of these for when disaster strikes. You don't have to explain to your doctor that, hey, I'm a prepper and all this stuff. Jace Medical understands. Go through the link in the description. It's a little bit pricey, but medications nowadays are incredibly pricey. And as I mentioned, China is going to be experiencing a lot more delays in manufacturing and the exporting of products. And of course, now with the tension mounting between Russia and China, and there's also this lots of stuff going on within China, which may cause the regime there to want to invade Taiwan to take attention away from whatever other domestic issues they have going on. Then you have the tension with the yuan, petrodollar. You know, things are not looking good for the foreseeable future. Things are only looking more bleaker by the day. So get prepped, stay ready. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Canadian Prepper out.